Good morning. As I mentioned before from this pulpit, I love the Christmas season, the Advent, all the fun and the gatherings. But with all seasons and with all good things, often there's pros and cons. And I'm sure some of you have experienced that. The pro being, the joy. The cons being all the things that you have to get involved with at the end of the year. For some of you, it's projects at the end of the year. For some of you, it's all the preparing for family gatherings. For others, buying the gifts and battling the malls, the crowds at the malls. For others, it's just you're tired because of the snow. Boy, we had a lot of snow last week, right? Heavy snow. Of course, for the children, it's like, yay. But anyways, but for others, there are unique challenges of this season for different people. And for me as a pastor, and for most pastors, there is one unique challenge that you probably haven't thought much about, but I'll just lay it out for you. And here's the challenge. My professor of preaching told me this years ago when he was teaching us. He said, the challenge for pastors is that people have heard the Christmas story so many times. And for those who have been at the church for decades, you've heard the story many times, right? Haven't you? And in our congregation, we're not average age. We're a little older than most English-speaking congregations in most churches. And so we actually end up with a group that's heard the Christmas story many, many times. And how do you make it new? How do you make it fresh? How do you go back to the beginning? And how do you go back to bring something to you that is different? So I'm going to do that for you today. And it's something that, to me, it never occurred to me, but until this year, I did a little more research. And it does tie us back to our series on Isaiah. You see, I'm going to go to the Christmas story that's a little bit beyond the birth narratives, but there's a strange little line that's tucked away in Matthew's gospel. It appears almost in passing, almost as if Matthew assumes that we already know it. And Joseph brings Jesus back from Egypt, Matthew tells us, and then he settles this family in a small, forgotten village called Nazareth. And then Matthew writes, so was fulfilled what we said by the prophets. He will be called a Nazarene. And instantly, there is actually a mystery here. Because if you look through the Old Testament, now let me ask you, those of you that know the Bible, where in the Old Testament is that prophecy? And which prophet mentioned that Jesus will be called, that the Messiah will be a Nazarene? Any thoughts? Well, you won't find that prophecy anywhere, specifically a verse that says the Messiah will be called a Nazarene. So why does Matthew say that? Hey, is this the proof that the Bible is not right? What prophecy is he talking about? And why would it matter that Jesus grew up in a place as obscure as Nazareth? Now, this surprising claim in Matthew is actually, when you unravel it, it's one of the most beautiful threads in the entire Christmas story. Because if you pull on it a little bit, it leads you back to the book of Isaiah. Back to the promises that God made centuries earlier. Into a hope that grows not in palaces, but in stumps. Not in the spotlight, but in obscurity. Not through the powerful, but through the humble. Last week, we began our journey through Isaiah. Now, David has been going through Isaiah in detail, and we don't have the luxury of doing that on Sunday mornings in the pulpit. But Isaiah is like a long highway where every few miles you see a sign, and it points to the coming king. And today, Matthew is saying to you and I, if you want to understand why Jesus is a Nazarene, you've got to go back to Isaiah. You must go back to the branch. So let's follow Matthew's thread, follow it from Nazareth, back to Isaiah, back to a stump, back to a branch, back to the promise of a king who comes in humility. To understand why Matthew calls this obscure hometown a fulfillment of prophecy, we need to see what Isaiah means when he speaks of a branch growing from a stump, and why that humble image prepares us for a Messiah who will be known as the Nazarene, or a Nazarene. You see, the world of Isaiah, let's give you some context, right? Talks about a stump. It's a stump where a kingdom used to be. In Isaiah 11, where our passage is read to us, it opens with one of the most striking images in Scripture. A shoot will come up from the stump of Jesse, from the roots, a branch will bear fruit. Why a stump? Well, because the Davidic line, dynasty at that time, was actually collapsing. The monarchy had been cut down by idolatry, by corruption, by injustice, and foreign invasion. And the house of David looked finished at that point. And Isaiah chooses the name Jesse, though. Why Jesse instead of David? David was the famous forefather, right? It's a way of saying this: God will start again. He's going to start again, not from the height of royal power, but from the humble beginnings of David's father, Jesse. God does not rebuild the old political machine. The Messiah is not here just to build up Israel into a powerhouse politically. It's much more than that. He raises up something, God is raising up something totally new, pure, humble, spirit-filled. This is Isaiah's message. God's salvation begins small, his redemption begins quietly, and God's king grows like a shoot through hard soil, like a tree growing out of cracked sidewalk pavements. You know, that's what the Bible is about primarily. It's about God's kingdom coming down. Now, that's where a lot of us Christians get it wrong. We think the Bible is all about ourselves, right? We read through it personalized, that God's written a love letter to us, which is true. And it is about personal salvation, which is true. But it's not primarily about just personal salvation. The Bible, actually, I got this idea recently from N.T. Wright, the scholar. He pointed out that when you read the Bible properly, you'll see that the real focus is on, particularly in the New Testament, is when Jesus comes on. It's the inauguration of the kingdom. It's God's kingdom coming to earth, right? But here, we're starting to see what's happening with this Messiah. He's going to inaugurate that kingdom. The branch, we're told, will come. There'll be spirit, there'll be justice, there'll be renewal. And in Isaiah chapter 11, the branch is described actually in three movements, I call it. Right? First of all, the spirit-filled character of the Messiah, verses 1 to 5. The Spirit of the Lord rests upon him: wisdom, understanding, counsel, might, knowledge, and the fear of the Lord. This is a king whose authority flows not from political power or force or might, intimidation. No, it's from the fullness of God's Spirit. And we're told very clearly in Isaiah that he judges with righteousness, he defends the poor, he cannot be bribed, he can't be swayed or fooled or corrupted. He sees with God's eyes. This is the king that Israel maybe didn't long for, but needs. The king that the world really needs. Some of us long for it, but not everybody. And we're also told by Isaiah that the world is under his rule, will be under the rule of the Messiah, verse 6 to 9. The wolf and the lamb, the leopard with the goat, the child with the serpent, these images describe a reversal of hostility. Under the branch's reign, wounds will be healed, fear is removed, and creation is rewarded towards peace. The earth will be full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. That's the beautiful promise. This is Isaiah's dream. That is God's promise. This is the Messiah's work. And then, wow, the gathering of the nations. Verse 10, the branch becomes a signal, a banner, and the nations seek him. And Isaiah's message is not of a local deliverer, not just a deliverer of the Jews from the Roman rule, but he's a savior of all peoples. What a glorious, glorious vision. But then we have, from the branch to the Nazarene, a mystery. And let's see this connection here between Matthew and Isaiah. Matthew writes, as I told you, he was fulfilled what was said by the prophets. He'll be called a Nazarene. And here's the issue, once again, no Old Testament specific prophecy by one specific prophet. So what is Matthew doing? Well, now this is not my idea, okay? Scholars throughout the ages have pointed this out, and it's pretty universal in their understanding of this passage. But basically, one key thing is that Matthew points out that it's spoken by the prophets, plural, not the prophet. So he's not pointing to one specific verse. He's summarizing a theme taken by many of the prophets. And the key here is the connection to the Hebrew, which most of us here, unless we have Stephen Hawkins here, we wouldn't get the sound, right? But here's this. In Isaiah 11:1, the word is Nazar. Sometimes spelled N-E-T-S-E-R, sometimes spelled N-E-S-E-R, right? And that's the Hebrew word for branch. And it sounds, though, like Nazarene, right? The Hebrew word for Nazarene. Matthew, then, is making a connection. Scholars point that they are making a connection like this. Like, here's a connection. The Messiah is the branch from Jesse. That's David's line. The branch, then, Nazar, is the Nazar. Someone from Nazareth, a Nazarene from Nazareth town, Nazar town, will be the branch. He will be the Nazar branch, the Nazarene. So he's using a Hebrew pun, a play on words. He's not quoting a literal prophecy verse. And as scholars tell us, I'm not the scholar in Hebrew literature in that way, but that's actually the very common Jewish interpretive tradition for this passage, right? And the connection between the Messiah and the branch is all over the scriptures in the Old Testament. Isaiah 11:1 here. Isaiah 4, verse 2, the branch of the Lord is mentioned. Jeremiah 23, verse 5. Jeremiah 33, verse 15 mentions a righteous branch. In Zechariah 3, verse 8, and Zechariah 6, verse 12, we're referring to the branch as his servant, God's servant, my servant, the branch. So here Matthew is connecting or capturing a wider prophetic imagery. But he's doing something much, much more deeper. It's much more fuller and deeper than you realize, than we would realize in our modern world. Because we need to understand this. We need to understand what Nazareth was like in Jesus' time, in the first century, right? It was obscure, and it was despised. And Jesus coming from Nazareth would be obscure. He'd be considered despised. It's kind of like someone coming from a small town in Ontario. There's so many of these small towns, right? There's I try to think of some small towns. I thought of Bancroft. I thought of Listwell. There's Sioux Lookout. It's like Jesus coming from Sioux Lookout, right? In the first century, it was not even a city. Nazareth was not even a town of note. It only had a few dozen families in it. Archaeology suggests a population of perhaps between 100 to 400, probably closer to 100 at most. The village itself is only a few acres in size. It was agricultural. It was poor. It was isolated. You know, Nazareth, look it up, it never appears in the Old Testament. You know, not even Josephus, the Jewish historian, when he mentions dozens of Galilean towns, he doesn't once mention Nazareth. It doesn't even appear in ancient literature until the time of Jesus. It's obscure, overlooked, insignificant. That's why Nathanael in the New Testament, in John 1:46, when they mention that Jesus is from Nazareth, he goes, can anything good come from Nazareth? He goes, that's like a derisive term, right? So when Matthew says Jesus fulfilled prophecy by being a Nazarene, he is drawing on this prophetic theme that the Messiah would be humble, rejected, despised, and of lowly appearance. You know, Nazareth was Nazareth of Galilee. Very specifically, it's mentioned all over the New Testament, the Gospels. Why? Because Galilee itself has theological significance. It is not just a background of Jesus' ministry. It preaches a message to us all by itself. It represents the margins, Galilee. It's far from Jerusalem, right? Nazareth, they say, was like 100 kilometers. It's kind of like from here to like Niagara Falls, right? To get to there in those days, you don't take a bus or you don't drive. It would take 4 or 5 days of journeying by donkey or by walking, right? It was far from Jerusalem. Jerusalem was the religious center. It was the big city. It was people from Jerusalem viewed people from Galilee, from Nazareth, as spiritually suspect and actually culturally mixed. Why? Because it was populated by ordinary people, fishermen, farmers, tradespeople, that actually had a mixture with Gentiles. We're told several times. I'll get to it in a minute, but Jerusalem had the temple, they had the elites, they had scholars. Galilee had what? The Galilee had boats, nets, dirt roads. They had funny accents. People mocked it. Matthew 26, verse 73. They mocked the Galilean accent. So God begins his kingdom away from power, not at the center of prestige. We're told in 1 Corinthians, Paul tells us in chapter 1, verse 27, God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. And sure as anything, someone in first century Palestine would look at a person from Galilee and from Nazareth as someone that's foolish in this world's eyes. You know, it's a fulfillment of Isaiah's prophecy. Matthew explicitly frames Galilee as prophetic fulfillment. Galilee, now we're told in Matthew, of the Gentiles, people dwelling in darkness have seen a great light, right? And that's crucial. Galilee was called of the Gentiles because it had a mixed population, right? The Messiah's light shines first where darkness and ambiguity are greatest. God's salvation is not delayed until things are pure or central. God's light begins where darkness is deepest. And Jesus' pattern of ministry and where he came from is a statement. Because, by the way, in his ministry, nearly everything fundamental happens in Galilee. He calls his disciples, Sermon on the Mount, most miracles, table fellowship with sinners, kingdom parables, all in Galilee. Even after the resurrection, we're told, the angel says in Matthew 28, verse 7, he is going ahead of you into Galilee, right? There you will see him. The risen Christ returns to the margins, not to the throne rooms, to the theological centers of the world. Galilee rewrites expectations of the Messiah. Many expected a Jerusalem-based king, a temple-centered reformer, a politically aligned deliverer. Instead, Jesus is a Nazarene, a Galilean village no one expected. By the way, he's not a Nazarite. Someone might point out that he thinks he's a Nazarite. Numbers chapter 6, those are the ones that had those 3 vows. You can't drink heavy alcohol, can't cut your hair, can't touch a dead body, right? Jesus was not a Nazarite. I heard one commentator go, if you think Jesus was a Nazarite, you'd be Nazar-wrong. But the whole point is that he was a Nazarene, okay? There's a difference right here, okay? Right, so he's based out of an unknown place, or hardly known place. Jesus of Nazareth. Even on the cross, John tells us in his gospel, when they put that plaque above the cross, it said Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. That's where we get the Latin. I forget the Latin terms, but it's INRRS, I think, right? Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. That was a derisive term. That's like Jesus from nowhere, King of the Jews. That was supposed to be a sarcastic comment that Pilate put up there, right? See, Galilee prepares the way for the nations. It's a crossroads. Jewish and Gentiles interact there. There's trade routes. There's cultural overlapping. It becomes a launch pad for a gospel for all nations. So when they say Jesus is for a Nazarene, he is there inaugurating the kingdom that will be for all nations. This incarnation does not begin at the center of power, but at the margins, where God chose to come among us. He did not arrive in Jerusalem's palaces or emerge from the temple elite. He came from Galilee, from Nazareth, a place overlooked, distrusted, and dismissed. Isaiah foretold a shoot rising from the stump of Jesse, new life growing where hope looked cut down, and in Jesus of Nazareth, this promise takes flesh, and people have hope. The Messiah is formed among ordinary people. Some guy who speaks with a funny Galilean accent gathers fishermen rather than officials. And even on the cross, once again, is publicly named Jesus of Nazareth out of derision. Isaiah 53 tells us later, he was despised and rejected. He had no beauty or majesty. He was a man of sorrows. Nazareth embodies this. Jesus begins where no one expected. He comes from the margins, not the palace. Once again, he grows up among the poor and not the powerful. He shows us, Matthew is showing us, that humility that was prophesied in Isaiah 11, Isaiah 53 is fulfilled in the Messiah who is called the Nazarene. So what did we learn? That humility is the pathway of God's kingdom. You put Isaiah and Matthew together, and you see the shape of the gospel. Isaiah tells us that the Messiah will be a branch from the stump. Matthew tells us that the Messiah will be the Nazarene from an obscure village. And together, the Messiah's identity is marked with humility, smallness, and hidden glory. This is a pattern of God's work in this world, isn't it? God brings salvation through the world, though the world despises, through what the world despises. God exalts what the world ignores. He starts the kingdom in Nazareth, not in Rome, not in Jerusalem, not in the source of power. That's the shape of the Advent. That's the shape of the incarnation. That's the shape of discipleship. Isn't that wonderful? Well, how do we react to this? How should we respond? Well, I want to encourage us to do three things at least. Three calls. First of all, worship the King who comes in humility. Christmas is a story of God's choosing the small over the spectacular. He comes in a manger. He grows up in Nazareth. He identifies with the poor and the lonely. Ask yourself, do I look for God in the humble and the ordinary? Or do I only look for the impressive and the dramatic? The humble King invites humble worship. Secondly, I want you to practice justice that reflects the branch's justice. In Isaiah 11, the Messiah defends the poor and the vulnerable. Following him means defending the world, what the world overlooks. This week, try this. Try serving someone quietly. Try giving generously to someone who cannot repay. Try speaking for someone who has no voice, listening to someone who is ignored, welcoming someone who feels like an outsider. Be followers of the Nazarene by caring for people who are unloved in this world. This week, we got to be people of grace. I just heard a story yesterday of a man who was a Christian leader, and he talks about what changed him around because he was a bad student when he was younger. I don't know I can't give the wording as he gave it. He gave it as a testimony. I'll just give you the summary. He says that, I think grade 4 or 5, he was really a bad student. One day he did terribly in one of his tests, and his teacher was a woman of grace. And this is how she showed it. She loved him. She loved her students. She called him into her office, or called him to the front of the class after all the other students left. He looked at his mark. He had an F. He failed his test. Everybody else did pretty well. But she just handed him the paper gently and then asked him to come stay after class. He thought he'd be yelled out or something, right? But he wasn't. She handed his paper back to him. She referred to his paper and she said his test. And she said, I think his name was Stephen. She said, Stephen, you can do a lot better than this. And she was crying. She was crying because she had so much compassion and generosity and graciousness towards her students. Can you show that compassion and grace this week to someone who needs it at Christmas? This is a stressful time to so many people, isn't it? Maybe you need that yourself. This is a stressful time. Thirdly, I want you to embrace your own Nazareth calling. What does that mean? Now, this might be the most personal application, I think, for today. You may feel small. Your ministry may feel unnoticed. Your work may feel insignificant. Your situation may feel like a stump. But remember, Nazareth was small, obscure, and dismissed. God chose it for the cradle of redemption. Your Nazareth is not your shame. It is your mission. It is where God delights to work. If God can grow the branch from a stump and raise the Messiah from Nazareth, he can make your life a place where his glory grows and reaches to the world. The King calls you to come this Christmas season. Church, and you are the church if you're a believer. The branch has come. The King has arrived. The Spirit has rested on him. The cross shows his love. The resurrection proclaims his victory. And his whole story, from Isaiah to Nazareth, is shaped not by worldly glory, but by humble coming. He did not come only for the confident and the strong. He came for the broken, for the weary, for the sinners, and for the hurting. And for those whose lives feel like they're in the dumps, in a stump. And that spirit of invitation is captured. By the way, I heard a song this past week on Christian radio. It was by a couple, Charlie and Jill LeBlanc. And they took a Christmas carol that everybody knows, O come, all you faithful. I'm not going to sing it for you. I'll save you that. O come, all you faithful, right? But they reword it. They said this, O come, all you faithful. O come, all you faithless, you broken and downhearted. O come ye now to receive the love of God. Jesus the Savior has come to bring new life to you. O come now and receive him. He'll make you free from your sin. Come open up your heart to Christ the Lord. It's a fresh call from an old hymn. A call that sounds very much like Isaiah's vision and Matthew's gospel. Come, not just the faithful, not those who are powerful in this world's eyes, but come as you are, weak, worn, in need, and humble, and desperate. This is the invitation of the branch. This is the welcome of the Nazarene. So come all you weary, all you broken. Come all who long for hope. Come and behold him, born the King of our souls. Let's remember once more. Oh, come all you faithful, joyful and triumphant. There's a reason to be joyful. Come, let us adore him, Christ the Lord.